My mother's hand gripped the invoice so tightly the paper crumpled at the edges. "We're not funding this circus," she said, her voice cutting through the florist's showroom like winter wind through silk. Behind her, my stepfather Richard crossed his arms, nodding with the satisfaction of someone who had won an argument I hadn't known we were having. What they didn't know was that the house they were standing in later that evening, the one they believed they owned outright, had my name on the deed. And I had the documents to prove it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started with optimism that now felt absurdly naive. I had driven 3 hours from Boston to my hometown of Lexington, Connecticut, with my fiancé Marcus sleeping in the passenger seat, his head tilted against the window as countryside rolled past in shades of autumn gold and fading green. We had an appointment at Enchanted Blooms, the same florist my mother had used for her own wedding to Richard 5 years ago. And I had foolishly believed that sharing this ritual would create a bridge between the life I was building and the family I came from. Marcus and I had been together for 4 years, having met during our graduate programs at MIT where I studied architectural engineering and he completed his doctorate in environmental science. Our relationship had been built on mutual respect, shared ambition, and the kind of partnership where both people grow stronger rather than smaller. He proposed on a beach in Cape Cod at sunrise, and I said yes before he finished his rehearsed speech because I had never been more certain of anything in my life. Planning the wedding had been a joy, mostly because we approached it as a collaboration rather than a production, focusing on creating an experience that reflected our values rather than performing for the expectations of others. My mother had seemed pleased when I called to tell her about the engagement. She asked appropriate questions about the ring, the proposal, and our timeline. She even offered to help with planning, which I accepted cautiously, knowing that her assistance often came with strings attached but hoping that this milestone might be different. For the first few months, her involvement was helpful rather than controlling. She suggested vendors, reviewed contracts with a sharp eye for problematic clauses, and seemed genuinely invested in making sure the day would be everything Marcus and I envisioned. The shift began so gradually I didn't recognize it as a pattern until it was fully established. Small comments about guest list choices became pointed questions about why certain people were included. Enthusiasm about our chosen venue cooled into criticism about accessibility and parking. Suggestions about the menu evolved into insistence that certain dishes were non-negotiable regardless of our preferences. Each individual instance seemed minor enough to accommodate for the sake of family harmony, but cumulatively they represented a steady erosion of our authority over our own celebration. Richard's involvement was newer and more overtly problematic. He had entered my mother's life 3 years after my father's death, presenting himself as a successful financial consultant who could provide the stability and partnership she deserved after years of widowhood. I was 26 when they married, old enough to have my own life and perspective but still young enough to want my mother to be happy more than I wanted to be right about my reservations. From the beginning, Richard treated me with a particular kind of dismissiveness that men of his generation and disposition reserve for young women they consider naive, overly educated, or insufficiently deferential. He spoke over me in conversations, corrected my statements about my own experiences, and frequently made jokes at my expense that he framed as affectionate teasing, but that everyone present understood as assertions of dominance. My mother never defended me in these moments. She laughed along with his jokes, changed the subject when his condescension became too obvious to ignore, and later told me privately that I was too sensitive and that Richard's humor just took getting used to. I learned to limit my time around them, to keep visits short and conversations superficial, and to build my life in Boston where their influence couldn't reach. The florist appointment was supposed to be straightforward. Marcus and I had already made most of our decisions during a previous visit, selecting arrangements that featured native New England flowers, seasonal blooms that wouldn't require excessive shipping, and a color palette of deep burgundy, gold, and sage green that reflected the October wedding date. This follow-up appointment was primarily to finalize quantities, confirm delivery logistics, and place the deposit that would secure our order. I had invited my mother as a courtesy, wanting to include her in at least some aspects of the planning despite the growing tension around other decisions. She arrived at Enchanted Blooms 20 minutes late, Richard in tow despite the fact that I had not invited him. I should have recognized this as a warning sign, But I was still operating under the assumption that my mother's occasional boundary violations were annoying rather than strategic. The florist, a warm woman in her 50s named Patricia who had been infinitely patient with our many questions and revisions, greeted my mother with the professional friendliness she showed all clients. She began walking us through the final proposal, showing updated photos of sample arrangements and explaining the timeline for delivery and setup at our venue. My mother interrupted Patricia before she finished the first sentence. "These flowers are completely wrong for an October wedding," she announced, pointing at the inspiration photos Marcus and I had carefully selected. "You need traditional fall flowers. Chrysanthemums, marigolds, orange roses. This palette is far too muted. People will think you're attending a funeral, not celebrating a marriage." I felt Marcus tense beside me, his hand finding mine under the table. "We specifically chose this palette because we don't want the typical orange and brown aesthetic," I explained, keeping my voice level. "These colors are sophisticated and seasonal without being cliché. We've been very clear about our vision." Richard leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "Your vision needs to consider what guests expect," he said, his tone suggesting he was explaining something obvious to someone slow to understand. "People attend weddings to see certain things. Flowers that look like flowers, not weeds arranged by someone's art school dropout." Patricia's professional smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "These are actually quite expensive blooms," she said carefully. "The dahlias alone are premium grade, and the amaranthus is imported specifically for high-end events. The arrangement is quite sophisticated." My mother waved her hand dismissively. "I'm sure they're very nice for certain types of events, but this is my daughter's wedding. Our family has a reputation in this community, and I won't have people talking about how we cheaped out on flowers." She turned to me, her expression shifting to something that approximated maternal concern. "Sweetheart, I know you and Marcus have certain ideas, but you have to trust that I know what works for events like this. I've been to dozens of weddings in our social circle, and I can tell you what people expect." The phrase "our social circle" landed like a stone in still water. My mother's social circle consisted of Richard's business associates and their wives, people I had met perhaps twice and who had no bearing on my life or wedding. Marcus and I had deliberately kept our guest list small, focusing on people who had been present and supportive throughout our relationship rather than obligatory invitations to distant relatives or parents' acquaintances. The wedding was not designed to impress my mother's friends. It was designed to celebrate our partnership in a way that felt authentic to who we were. "Mom, I appreciate your input," I said, hearing the strain entering my voice despite my efforts at diplomacy. "But Marcus and I are paying for these flowers ourselves. We've made our decision and we're happy with it. Patricia has been wonderful in helping us create exactly what we want." The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly. My mother's face shifted through several expressions in rapid succession, landing on something cold and resolute. "Actually, Amanda, that's what I needed to talk to you about." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a folder I hadn't noticed before. "Richard and I have been reviewing your wedding budget, and we have some serious concerns." Marcus and I exchanged glances. We had shared our budget with my mother months ago as a courtesy, making clear that we were funding the wedding ourselves and not requesting financial assistance. Both of us had good jobs we had been saving deliberately, and we had planned an event we could afford without going into debt or depending on family contributions. The budget was not particularly lavish by wedding industry standards, but it was sufficient for our priorities and reflected our values around sustainable spending. "We're on track with our budget," I said, confusion mixing with growing apprehension. "Everything is accounted for, and we're well within our means. There's nothing to be concerned about." Richard pulled out his own folder, this one notably thicker. "I've done a comprehensive analysis," he began, his voice taking on the lecturing quality he used when explaining financial concepts to people he assumed understood nothing about money. "Your budget is fundamentally unsound. You're overspending in some areas while neglecting others entirely. The venue cost is excessive for what you're getting. The photography package is overpriced. And these flowers," he tapped the invoice Patricia had placed on the table, "are a perfect example of poor value allocation." I felt heat rising in my chest, that particular combination of anger and humiliation that comes from being treated like a child who cannot manage her own affairs. Richard, with all due respect, our budget is none of your business. Marcus and I are both financially stable professionals. We know what we're doing. Clearly you don't, my mother interjected, her voice sharp, which is why we're stepping in before you make decisions you'll regret. We've decided that if we're going to have any association with this wedding, we need to have control over the budget and the vendors. We have contacts, experience, and frankly better judgment about what makes sense. The presumption was so staggering that for a moment I couldn't formulate a response. Marcus, however, found his voice. I'm sorry, but we haven't asked you to have any association with the wedding beyond being guests. Amanda and I are managing everything ourselves. We appreciate your concern, but we don't need or want financial control transferred to anyone else. Richard's expression hardened into something openly hostile. Then you're on your own. Completely. We won't be contributing a single dollar to this disaster. And more than that, we won't be endorsing it. As far as our family and friends are concerned, this wedding doesn't have our support. My mother nodded, her jaw set. We're not funding this circus, she repeated, the words clearly rehearsed. If you insist on making these choices against our advice, you do it without our money and without our name attached. We have a reputation to protect, and I won't let your stubbornness damage what we've built in this community. Patricia had gone completely still, her eyes fixed on the table as she tried to make herself invisible during this family confrontation. I felt a wave of embarrassment for subjecting her to this scene, followed immediately by white-hot anger at my mother and Richard for creating it in the first place. The threats were clearly designed to force capitulation, to make us so desperate to avoid family rupture and social embarrassment that we would hand over control of our own wedding to people who had no right to it. What shocked me more than the ultimatum itself was the casual cruelty with which it was delivered. This was not a mother concerned about her daughter's financial well-being. This was a power play, an assertion of control designed to remind me that despite my education, career, and adult life, they still considered themselves the ultimate authority over my choices. The message was clear. Comply or be punished through withdrawal of approval, support, and family connection. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. The woman who had raised me, who had supported my education and celebrated my achievements, had been gradually replaced by someone who prioritized Richard's opinions over her daughter's autonomy. Or perhaps she had always been this person and I had simply been too young or too hopeful to recognize it clearly. Either way, the person sitting across from me was willing to sabotage my wedding to maintain control and satisfy her husband's ego. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus squeezed my hand, a gesture of solidarity that reminded me I was not alone in this moment. I took a slow breath, feeling my heartbeat steady even as my mind raced through implications and responses. The threat was designed to make me panic, to make me afraid of losing family support and social standing. But as I sat there, I realized something that shifted the entire dynamic. I was not afraid. I was angry, yes, and hurt certainly, but not afraid. Because unlike my mother and Richard, I had not built my life on the foundation of other people's approval. I had built it on competence, partnership, and integrity. Their withdrawal of financial support meant nothing because we had never asked for it. Their withdrawal of social endorsement meant nothing because our community was not their community. And most importantly, I knew something they did not know, something that would fundamentally alter the power dynamic they believed they controlled. That's your decision to make, I said quietly, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Marcus and I will proceed with our wedding exactly as planned. We'll see you there if you choose to attend as guests. If not, we'll miss your presence, but we won't miss your control. My mother's eyes widened slightly, clearly not expecting this response. Richard's face flushed, the color rising from his collar to his hairline. Don't take that tone with your mother, he snapped. You have no idea what you're throwing away. Family support means everything, and you're tossing it aside for what? Flowers? Your precious vision? Grow up, Amanda. I stood, gathering my bag and reaching for Marcus's hand. Patricia, I apologize for this disruption. Can we reschedule this appointment for later this week? Just Marcus and myself. Patricia nodded quickly, relief evident in her expression. Of course. I'll send you some available times this afternoon. Take all the time you need. As Marcus and I moved toward the door, my mother called after us. If you walk out that door, there are consequences, Amanda. Real consequences that go beyond this wedding. Think very carefully about what you're choosing. I paused, my hand on the door handle, and turned back to face her. I have thought carefully. For years, actually. And I've realized that I'd rather have integrity than approval. The wedding will go forward as planned. With or without you. We left the florist's shop, the door chiming softly behind us as we stepped into the cool October air. Marcus wrapped his arm around my shoulders as we walked toward our car, neither of us speaking until we were safely inside with the doors closed. Then he turned to me, his expression concerned but not pitying. Are you okay? He asked simply. I surprised myself by laughing, though it came out slightly unsteady. I think so. Actually, I feel strangely clear. Like something that's been building for years just finally broke open. They can't actually do anything to hurt us, Marcus said, his voice firm. We're financially independent. We don't need their approval or their money. They're bluffing. I know, I said, leaning my head back against the seat. But it's not a bluff about nothing. There are consequences, just not the ones they think matter. Family rupture is real, even when the family is toxic. It still hurts. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then asked carefully, when you mentioned having something they don't know about, what did you mean? I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my secured files until I found what I was looking for. On the screen was a scanned document, official and unmistakable. A property deed for the house at 247, Birchwood Lane, Lexington, Connecticut. The house where my mother and Richard lived. The house they believed they owned. The owner listed on the deed was not Richard Coleman or Evelyn Morgan Coleman. It was Amanda Catherine Morgan. Me. My father bought that house in my name when I was 16, I said quietly, showing Marcus the document. It was part of his estate planning. He wanted to make sure my mother would always have a place to live, but he also wanted to protect the asset in case something happened. The house is held in trust with me as the beneficiary and legal owner. My mother has lifetime residency rights, but she can't sell it, mortgage it, or transfer ownership without my consent. Marcus stared at the document, then at me. Does she know this? She knew when my father died. The lawyer explained it to both of us. But I think she forgot, or Richard convinced her it didn't matter. Or they assumed because I never mentioned it that I had somehow lost that protection. I looked at the deed on my phone screen, feeling the weight of what it represented. Every property tax bill goes to my accountant. Every insurance payment comes from the trust account my father set up. They live there rent-free because of my father's planning and my willingness to maintain those payments. They have no idea how precarious their position actually is. Marcus let out a long breath. You could revoke her residency rights. I could, I acknowledged. Though I won't, because that would violate my father's wishes and my own values. But they don't know that I won't. And maybe it's time they understood that the power dynamic they're assuming doesn't actually exist. We sat in the car for a long while, watching leaves skitter across the parking lot in the October wind. Inside the florist's shop, I could see Patricia moving around, likely recovering from the scene she had just witnessed. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Call me when you're ready to be reasonable. We can still fix this. I didn't respond. Instead, I started the car, adjusted the mirrors, and pulled out of the parking lot. Marcus was quiet beside me, processing what I had revealed and what it meant for the confrontation that was clearly not finished. As we drove back toward Boston, the autumn landscape rolling past in shades of fire and gold, I felt something settling in my chest. Not quite peace, but clarity. Purpose. My mother and Richard had made their choice. They had decided that control mattered more than connection, that power mattered more than presence. They had issued threats designed to make me smaller, to force me back into a role I had outgrown years ago. They had assumed I was still the young woman who left Connecticut for Boston, still seeking approval, still willing to compromise myself to maintain family harmony. They were about to discover how wrong they were. And when they did, the conversation would no longer be about flowers or wedding budgets or social reputations. It would be about foundations, both literal and metaphorical. About what my father had built to protect me, and what I was prepared to do to honor that protection. The wedding would go forward exactly as Marcus and I planned. Beautiful, intimate, authentic. With or without my mother's approval. With or without Richard's endorsement. Because I had learned something essential in the years since leaving home. Approval from people who don't respect you is worthless. And threats from people who don't know what you're capable of are just noise. As we crossed the state line back into Massachusetts, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I needed. Lawrence Weinstein, the attorney who had managed my father's estate and the trust that held the house. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year, maintaining the arrangement quietly and without drama. But now it was time for a different kind of conversation. I didn't call yet. First, I needed to think through exactly what I wanted to say and what I was prepared to do. But the number was there, ready when the time came. And something told me that time was approaching faster than my mother could possibly anticipate. She had canceled my wedding or tried to. She had withdrawn her support and threatened consequences. What she didn't know was that I had been protecting her all along, maintaining the home she took for granted, preserving the security my father had built for her. And now that protection came with a price: respect, boundaries, and the acknowledgement that I was not a child to be controlled but an adult whose choices deserved recognition. The confrontation was coming. Not today but soon. And when it arrived, my mother would discover what real consequences looked like. Not the emotional manipulation she had wielded in the florist shop, but the practical reality of legal authority she had forgotten existed. I didn't want to use that power. But I would if necessary. Because some lessons can only be learned the hard way, and some people only respect boundaries when those boundaries have teeth. The highway stretched ahead, carrying us home to Boston where our life together waited. Behind us, Lexington receded into the distance, carrying with it the version of family I had once believed in. Ahead was uncertainty, conflict, and the hard work of establishing new terms for old relationships. But also ahead was the wedding Marcus and I would create together, the life we were building, and the integrity that came from refusing to compromise yourself for someone else's comfort. My mother had said there would be consequences for walking out that door. She was right about that much. But the consequences would not fall where she expected them. And when they did, she would understand that the daughter she tried to control had grown into a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. The next move was hers. But the power had always been mine. The drive back to Boston gave me 3 hours to think, which turned out to be both a blessing and a curse. Marcus had fallen asleep again within 20 minutes of leaving Lexington, his breathing steady and peaceful in a way that I envied. My mind, however, refused to settle. It kept circling back through the years, trying to pinpoint exactly when my relationship with my mother had shifted from complicated but loving to this current state of conditional acceptance and strategic manipulation. My father, Thomas Morgan, had been an architect specializing in historic preservation and sustainable design. He built a successful practice over 30 years, working primarily in New England where countless buildings needed careful restoration that balanced historical integrity with modern functionality. He was methodical, patient, and deeply principled about his work. Every project he took on received the same level of attention, whether it was a prominent public building or a modest residential renovation. Quality, he often said, was not negotiable regardless of budget or timeline. Growing up as his daughter meant absorbing those values through osmosis and direct instruction. He took me to job sites from the time I was old enough to wear a hard hat without it sliding over my eyes. He explained load-bearing walls, foundation issues, and architectural styles in the same tone. He used to discuss what I learned at school that day. His office had a drafting table where he worked in the evenings, and I would sit beside him doing homework while he sketched elevations and details, the scratch of his pencil and the smell of tracing paper becoming synonymous with safety and belonging. My mother, Evelyn, had been a high school English teacher when she met my father. She was 24, newly hired at Lexington Academy, and assigned to supervise the drama club's fall production. My father had volunteered to help build the sets, donating both his expertise and materials from a recent project. According to family legend, they had their first conversation while debating the structural integrity of a castle facade, and by the time the show opened, they were inseparable. She matched his quiet intensity with her own passion for literature and language. Their early marriage, from what I could piece together from photos and stories, seemed to be a genuine partnership of complementary strengths. I was born 2 years after their wedding, an only child who received the concentrated attention of two intelligent, engaged parents who took their roles seriously. My childhood was stable in ways I only fully appreciated later. We ate dinner together every night, discussed ideas and current events, and maintained rituals like Sunday morning pancakes and Friday evening library visits that created rhythm and predictability. Money was never abundant but always sufficient. We lived comfortably in a modest house that my father gradually improved and expanded, each renovation teaching me something about craft, planning, and the satisfaction of making something better than you found it. When I was 16, my father sat me down for what he called an important conversation about adult responsibilities. He explained that he had purchased a new property, a larger house in a better neighborhood that would give my mother more space and security. But unlike their first home, this property was being held in a trust with me as the primary beneficiary. He walked me through the legal documents, explaining each provision with the same care he brought to architectural specifications. The house would be my mother's home for as long as she lived, with lifetime residency rights that could not be revoked. But the ownership, the ultimate legal authority, would rest with me. At 16, I had not fully grasped the significance of this arrangement. I understood it intellectually as an estate planning strategy, a way to protect assets and provide for my mother while minimizing tax complications. But I did not understand it emotionally or practically. I certainly did not imagine that this legal structure would ever become relevant to my actual relationship with my mother. It seemed like paperwork, important but abstract, the kind of adult responsibility that existed in filing cabinets and lawyers' offices rather than in lived experience. My father explained his reasoning carefully. He was not anticipating his own death, or at least he claimed he was not. But he had seen too many situations in his professional life where families lost homes due to poor planning, unexpected circumstances, or predatory relationships that emerged during vulnerable periods. He wanted to ensure that my mother would always have security, but he also wanted to ensure that I would have authority if decisions ever needed to be made about the property. He trusted me, he said, to honor his intentions while also exercising good judgment about changing circumstances. I remember asking him if my mother knew about the arrangement. He assured me that she did, that they had discussed it thoroughly, and that she understood and agreed with his reasoning. She was a beneficiary of the trust in the sense that she could live in the house without rent or mortgage payments, with all major expenses covered by the trust account he had established and funded. But she was not the owner. That distinction, he emphasized, was important and intentional. 2 years later, my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The disease moved with terrifying speed, taking him from diagnosis to death in less than 7 months. He was 52 years old. I was 18, newly graduated from high school and preparing to start college. The scholarship I had earned to MIT, which had once represented exciting possibility, suddenly felt like abandonment. How could I leave my mother alone to grieve? How could I pursue my own future when the foundation of our family had just collapsed? My father, even in his final weeks, addressed this directly. He called me to his bedside one afternoon when my mother was out of the house and spoke with the clarity that pain medication occasionally allowed between periods of confusion. He told me that I should go to MIT, that I should build the life and career I had worked toward, and that my mother would be fine. She was stronger than I realized, he said. She would grieve, and that grief would be real and difficult, but she would survive it and eventually rebuild. My responsibility was not to stay and manage her emotions but to honor what he had taught me by becoming the person I was capable of becoming. He also reminded me about the house, about the trust, about the arrangements he had made to ensure financial stability. Lawrence Weinstein, his attorney, would manage the administrative details. I would receive quarterly reports but would not need to take any active role until I was older and more established. The system was designed to run itself, to provide security without requiring constant attention. He made me promise that I would let it do exactly that I would not sacrifice my education or early career to handle things that were already handled. I kept that promise, though it felt like tearing myself in half. I went to MIT that fall, moved into my dorm, and tried to build a new life while processing grief that felt oceanic in its depth and persistence. I called my mother multiple times per week, came home for long weekends whenever possible, and spent my first winter break largely sitting with her in the house that still smelled like my father's coffee and the specific brand of wood polish he preferred. She seemed to be managing, moving through the stages of grief in ways that seemed normal and expected. She cried, she struggled. She had moments of anger and moments of peace. She talked about eventually returning to teaching, about finding purpose again, about honoring my father's memory by living fully rather than remaining frozen in loss. The first 2 years after his death established a pattern that seemed sustainable. I focused on my demanding coursework, finding solace in the concrete challenges of physics, mathematics, and engineering principles. My mother gradually re-engaged with her life, returning to teaching part-time and reconnecting with friends who had given her space during the acute phase of mourning. We talked regularly but not constantly. We visited but maintained appropriate boundaries between her life and mine. The house remained secure, the trust functioned as designed, and I received quarterly reports from Lawrence that required nothing from me beyond brief review and filing. Richard Coleman entered my mother's life during my junior year at MIT. She mentioned him first in passing, referring to a financial consultant who had given a presentation at a community event she attended. Then he appeared more frequently in her conversation, always described in positive terms that emphasized his professionalism, his knowledge, his helpfulness with questions about insurance and investments that she found overwhelming. By the time she told me they were dating seriously, they had apparently been seeing each other for 6 months. I met Richard for the first time during spring break of that year. He was 53, 12 years older than my mother, and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most knowledgeable person in any room. He asked about my studies at MIT with what seemed like genuine interest, though I noticed he frequently interrupted my explanations to provide his own analysis or correction of points he misunderstood. He talked extensively about his career, his client base, and his philosophy about wealth management and financial security. He was not unkind exactly, but there was a quality of dismissiveness in how he engaged with both my mother and myself that I found unsettling. My mother seemed different around him, more deferential, quicker to laugh at jokes that were not particularly funny, less likely to express her own opinions when his differed. I told myself this was normal relationship adjustment, that people naturally adapted to new partners, that I was being overly critical because no one would ever match my father in my estimation. I wanted my mother to be happy. I wanted her to have companionship and support. I tried to be welcoming even as something in my gut insisted that Richard's interest in my mother had dimensions she was not seeing clearly. They married 2 years later when I was in my first year of graduate school. The wedding was small, held at a country club Richard belonged to, attended primarily by his professional associates and their spouses. My mother's longtime friends were invited, but seemed uncertain about their place in this new configuration. I served as witness, wearing a dress my mother selected, and smiled for photographs while experiencing a profound sense of dislocation. This was not grief exactly, because my mother deserved happiness and partnership, but it was loss of some kind, recognition that the relationship I had with my mother was changing in ways I could not control or predict. After the marriage, Richard moved into the house on Birchwood Lane. Neither my mother nor Richard consulted me about this decision, which was their right as adults managing their own living situation. But it marked the beginning of a pattern where decisions about the house were made as though Richard had authority that he did not legally possess. He began making changes immediately. The home office where my father had kept his drafting table was converted into what Richard called a proper study, with leather furniture and electronics that announced masculine professional success. The garden my mother had maintained was partially paved over to create additional parking for Richard's vehicles. Small changes accumulated into a comprehensive transformation that erased my father's presence from the physical space he had created. I said nothing about these changes initially. The house was my mother's home, and she had the right to make it comfortable for her new husband. The lifetime residency rights my father had established meant she could modify and use the property as she wished, within reason. I reminded myself that holding on to shrines to the past was unhealthy, that my mother needed to build a life with Richard, rather than remain frozen in widowhood. But each quarterly report from Lawrence included updated photos for insurance purposes, and each set of photos showed more erasure, more replacement, more evidence that Richard was establishing dominance over a space that was not his to control. The financial dimensions became apparent more slowly. During my second year of graduate school, I received a call from Lawrence asking me to come to his office when I was next in Connecticut. This was unusual enough to concern me, but his tone suggested it was important rather than urgent. When I met with him, He explained that Richard had contacted him multiple times about refinancing the property, taking out a home equity line of credit, or transferring the title into joint ownership with my mother. Lawrence had explained repeatedly that none of these actions were possible without my consent as the legal owner, but Richard continued to push, suggesting that the trust arrangement was an oversight that needed correction now that my mother had remarried. Lawrence advised me to be aware that Richard was attempting to access the home's equity, which had increased substantially since my father's purchase. The house was now worth nearly $800,000, sitting in a neighborhood that had appreciated significantly. For someone like Richard, whose financial consulting business was apparently less successful than he portrayed, this represented substantial untapped value that he believed should be available to him through his marriage to my mother. Lawrence recommended that I document any further attempts to pressure me or my mother about the property arrangements, and that I remain firm about the trust structure remaining unchanged. I followed his advice, though it created new awkwardness in my relationship with both my mother and Richard. When Richard raised the subject during a visit, suggesting that it made sense for the house to be jointly owned now that he and my mother were married, I explained clearly that the current arrangement honored my father's wishes and provided security that benefited my mother. Richard responded with barely concealed anger, suggesting that my refusal to modify the trust indicated distrust and disrespect toward his marriage to my mother. My mother, caught between us, said nothing in my defense, simply changing the subject and later telling me privately that I should be more flexible about things that did not really matter. But it did matter. The house represented more than equity or financial value. It represented my father's final act of protection for both my mother and myself. He had seen something that I was only beginning to understand, had anticipated scenarios that seemed paranoid when he described them but were proving prescient in practice. Richard was not simply my mother's husband seeking reasonable joint ownership. He was a man who viewed the house as an asset to be leveraged, who resented that a child held authority that he believed should belong to him as the household's male head, and who was systematically working to undermine the legal structure that prevented him from accessing value he wanted to control. The pattern continued and intensified over the following years. Richard made increasingly substantial changes to the property without consulting me, each one requiring explanation and sometimes repair when they violated code or created liability issues. He hosted parties that resulted in damage to original features my father had carefully preserved. He spoke about my mother's house, my mother's property, my mother's equity, despite knowing that none of those phrases were accurate. He treated me with increasing contempt during my infrequent visits, making clear that he considered my continued ownership an insult that he tolerated only because he could not yet figure out how to circumvent it. My mother's response to this dynamic was perhaps more painful than Richard's hostility. She had always been a strong woman, someone who advocated for herself and others, who challenged unfairness and stood firm on principles that mattered to her. But in her marriage to Richard, she became progressively smaller. She stopped disagreeing with him in front of others. She adopted his opinions as though they were her own conclusions. She defended his behavior even when it was clearly problematic, and she began treating me with a distance that suggested she viewed me as an obstacle to her marriage rather than her daughter deserving of consideration. I understood on some level that this was a survival strategy, that my mother had chosen emotional security with Richard over other values that once seemed non-negotiable to her. She was lonely after my father's death, vulnerable in ways that Richard exploited, and perhaps genuinely convinced herself that Richard's version of their relationship was accurate. But understanding her motivations did not lessen the hurt of being increasingly marginalized in her life, or the anger at watching her become complicit in Richard's attempts to undermine what my father had built to protect her. By the time Marcus and I got engaged, my relationship with my mother had settled into a careful superficiality. We talked about safe topics and avoided areas where conflict was likely. I visited rarely, usually for major holidays, and kept those visits brief. I had built my life in Boston deliberately separate from the complications of my mother's marriage, and I had convinced myself that this distance was sufficient protection. I would maintain the trust, preserve the house, fulfill my father's wishes, and otherwise minimize my exposure to Richard's toxicity and my mother's compliance with it. The wedding planning had briefly suggested that something different might be possible. My mother's initial enthusiasm felt genuine, her offers of help seemed sincere, And I allowed myself to hope that this milestone might create a bridge between the relationship we had and the relationship I still wished we could have. I should have recognized the warning signs earlier. The gradual shift from support to control, the increasing involvement of Richard in decisions that had nothing to do with him, the progressive assertion of authority over choices that were not theirs to make. But I wanted to believe that my mother would show up for me in this moment, that the importance of the occasion would override the dynamics that had become entrenched in her marriage. The confrontation at the florist's shop destroyed that hope definitively. The casual cruelty with which my mother delivered her ultimatum, the obvious coordination with Richard, the complete absence of any acknowledgement that Marcus and I were autonomous adults capable of making our own decisions, all of it revealed that the mother I remembered had been fully subsumed by the marriage she had chosen. She was not going to defend me against Richard. She was not going to prioritize our relationship over his demands. She had made her choice, and that choice was to align herself completely with a man who viewed me as an obstacle and our wedding as a venue for asserting control. As Marcus and I approached Boston, the skyline emerging through the autumn haze, I felt something settling inside me that was not quite acceptance, but was definitely clarity. I had spent years trying to maintain a relationship with my mother that no longer existed in any meaningful form. I had compromised my own boundaries, minimized legitimate concerns, and absorbed disrespect in the hope that patience and maturity would eventually be reciprocated. But the scene at the florist demonstrated conclusively that no amount of patience would change this dynamic. My mother had chosen subordination to Richard over solidarity with me, and I needed to stop pretending that choice was temporary or reversible. The wedding would proceed exactly as Marcus and I planned. We would create the celebration we envisioned, surrounded by people who actually supported our partnership and shared our values. My mother and Richard could attend or not attend as they chose, but their participation would be as guests without authority, opinion without weight. I would not negotiate with them, would not modify our plans to accommodate their preferences, and would not allow their disapproval to diminish what should be one of the most joyful experiences of our lives. But beyond the wedding, I recognized that a larger reckoning was approaching. The house on Birchwood Lane represented unfinished business, a legal authority I had maintained passively for years, but had never actively exercised. My father had trusted me to protect what he built, to ensure that my mother's security was preserved even if her judgment became compromised. For years, I had interpreted that responsibility as simply maintaining the status quo, paying the bills, preserving the structure. But perhaps my father had anticipated that a time would come when protection required more active intervention. Richard believed he had successfully marginalized me, that my distance and youth meant I could be dismissed without consequence. My mother believed that Richard's version of reality was accurate, that the house was theirs in any meaningful sense, and that my legal ownership was a technicality that did not translate into actual authority. They had built their lives on assumptions that were about to be tested in ways they could not anticipate. I was not my father, could never be my father, but I carried what he taught me about integrity, craftsmanship, and the importance of building things that lasted beyond immediate gratification. He had built that house not just as shelter but as legacy, not just as property but as protection. He had placed it in my hands because he trusted me to understand the difference between ownership and stewardship, between authority and abuse of power. The confrontation was coming, but it would happen on my terms at my timing with my full understanding of what was at stake and what I was willing to do to protect it. My mother had canceled my wedding, or tried to. She had withdrawn her support and threatened consequences. What she did not understand was that the real consequences were just beginning, and they would fall exactly where they should have fallen years ago. On the people who had taken protection for granted, security for weakness, and patience for permission. Marcus stirred beside me as we exited the highway into Boston proper, the familiar streets of our neighborhood emerging from the urban landscape. He opened his eyes, oriented himself, and looked at me with the quiet assessment that came from knowing someone deeply enough to read their emotional state without requiring explanation. "You have a plan," he said. It was not a question. I nodded slowly, my hand steady on the wheel as I navigated toward our apartment building. "I have the beginning of a plan. The rest will depend on what they do next." "And if they escalate?" he asked carefully. I thought about the deed on my phone, about the quarterly reports filed in our home office, about the legal authority I had held for over a decade without ever fully exercising it. I thought about my father explaining load-bearing walls and foundation integrity, about the difference between structures that only look solid and structures built to last through stress and storm. Then they'll discover what foundations actually mean, I said quietly. And they'll learn that some things are not negotiable, not available, and not theirs to take regardless of how entitled they feel. Marcus reached over and squeezed my hand, his touch warm and grounding. We pulled into our parking space, gathered our bags, and walked toward the elevator that would carry us up to the life we had built together. Behind us, Lexington waited with its complications and coming confrontations. Ahead of us, the wedding approached with its promise and possibility. And somewhere in between, on Birchwood Lane in a house my father built and I protected, the next chapter of this story was beginning to write itself. My mother would reach out again. Of that I was certain. She would try to repair the rupture she created, or more likely, she would escalate the conflict to force my compliance. Richard would push for more aggressive tactics, confident that I would eventually surrender to preserve family peace. They would assume that I had no real power beyond the legal technicality of ownership, that I was too young or too kind or too invested in familial harmony to actually exercise the authority my father had given me. They were about to discover how thoroughly they had misunderstood the situation. And when they did, everything they thought they knew about power, ownership, and consequence would require fundamental reassessment. The lesson was coming. I only hoped my mother would be capable of learning it before the costs became permanent. The first message arrived at 6:30 the following morning, while Marcus was in the shower and I was attempting to convince myself that coffee could substitute for actual sleep. My phone vibrated against the kitchen counter with a text from my mother that contained no greeting, no acknowledgement of the previous day's confrontation, just a simple directive disguised as a request. We need to talk. Come to the house this afternoon at 2. This has gone far enough. I stared at the message for a long moment, noting the presumption embedded in every word. The assumption that I would rearrange my schedule on demand, that I would travel 3 hours for a conversation she could have initiated with an apology, that this referred to my behavior rather than hers. The message perfectly encapsulated the dynamic Richard and my mother had constructed, where my resistance to their control was framed as the problem requiring correction, rather than their attempts at control being the actual issue. I set the phone down without responding and returned my attention to my coffee, watching steam rise from the dark surface while my mind worked through implications and strategies. The demand for an immediate meeting suggested urgency on their end, which meant they were worried about something beyond mere defiance. People secure in their position do not issue commands before 7 in the morning. They were reacting to a threat they had not fully identified, sensing that yesterday's confrontation had shifted something fundamental, even if they could not yet articulate what had changed. Marcus emerged from the bedroom 20 minutes later, already dressed for work in the business casual attire his environmental consulting firm required. He kissed the top of my head in passing, poured his own coffee, and leaned against the counter in the companionable silence we had mastered over 4 years together. He did not ask about my obvious preoccupation, trusting that I would share when ready, offering presence without pressure. "My mother wants me to come to Lexington this afternoon," I said finally, showing him the text. No explanation, just a summons. Marcus read the message, his expression shifting through several subtle variations before settling on concerned but measured. "Are you going?" "I do not know yet," I admitted. Part of me wants to refuse on principle, to make it clear that she does not get to issue commands and expect compliance. But another part recognizes that refusing might just delay an inevitable conversation that needs to happen sooner rather than later. "What do you think she wants to say?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already had theories. "I think she wants to explain why I am wrong, why I am being unreasonable, and why I need to accept their authority over wedding decisions that have nothing to do with them," I said, hearing the weariness in my own voice. "Or more accurately, I think Richard wants those things and my mother has been assigned to deliver the message in hopes that maternal guilt will succeed where his hostility failed." Marcus nodded slowly, considering this. "If you do go, do you want me to come with you?" The offer was genuine and I appreciated it deeply, but I also recognized that my mother's manipulation tactics worked best in isolation, and that having Marcus present would limit what she felt comfortable saying. If I was going to understand the full extent of what Richard had been telling her, what narrative they had constructed to justify their behavior, I needed to create space for her to speak without the self-consciousness that came from having her daughter's fiancé witness her complicity. I think I need to do this alone, I said. But I would like you to know where I am and to expect a call by 4 o'clock at the latest. If you do not hear from me by then, assume the conversation went badly and I need extraction. We discussed logistics over breakfast, Marcus offering perspective without attempting to direct my decision. By the time he left for his office, I had resolved to make the drive to Lexington, not because my mother had demanded it but because I needed to establish clearly that her assumptions about our relationship and her living situation were fundamentally incorrect. The conversation would happen on my terms even if it occurred at her preferred time and location. I texted back a single sentence. I will arrive at 2:30. This conversation will be brief. The extra 30 minutes was a small assertion of autonomy, a reminder that I would not jump at commands, and the promise of brevity established that I was not coming to negotiate or be persuaded but rather to state realities that she needed to hear. The drive to Lexington felt different in daylight, the autumn landscape less romantic and more stark, trees beginning to show the skeletal structure beneath their remaining foliage. I used the time to mentally rehearse the conversation, anticipating her likely arguments and preparing responses that were firm without being cruel, clear without being defensive. I reminded myself repeatedly that I was not responsible for managing her emotions, that her discomfort with truthful information was not my problem to solve, and that kindness did not require me to accept manipulation. The house on Birchwood Lane looked exactly as it had during my last visit 6 months earlier, though I saw it now through different eyes. The exterior updates Richard had made, replacing my father's carefully selected cedar shingles with cheaper vinyl siding, stood out as aesthetic degradation rather than improvement. The landscaping that had once reflected my mother's love of native plants and pollinator gardens had been simplified to generic foundation plantings that required minimal maintenance. Even the mailbox, which my father had custom-made from copper that would develop a natural patina, had been replaced with a standard black metal box that announced the address in stick-on numbers. I parked in the driveway behind Richard's Mercedes, a vehicle he had purchased the year after marrying my mother despite the fact that his previous car had been perfectly functional. The purchase had been justified as necessary for client meetings, for maintaining professional appearance, for reasons that amounted to ego and status-seeking but were presented as practical business decisions. I wondered now how that purchase had been financed, what equity or credit Richard had access to fund a lifestyle that his actual income probably did not support. My mother opened the door before I reached the porch, her expression caught between relief and apprehension. She had dressed carefully for this conversation, wearing slacks and a sweater that suggested casual authority, the kind of outfit she might wear for a parent-teacher conference where she needed to deliver difficult feedback. Her hair was styled, her makeup precise, all of it communicating that this was a formal discussion rather than a casual family visit. "Amanda, thank you for coming," she said, stepping back to let me enter. "I know yesterday was difficult, but I think we can work through this if we are all willing to be reasonable." The immediate framing of the conflict as mutual unreasonableness requiring bilateral compromise told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation was intended to proceed. I stepped into the foyer, noting that the family photos that had once lined the hallway had been replaced with abstract art that Richard preferred, and followed my mother into the living room where Richard sat in the leather armchair he had positioned to face the doorway like a throne. "Amanda," he said, not rising or offering any gesture of welcome, "I am glad you decided to be sensible about this. Your mother and I have given this situation a lot of thought, and we have some proposals that we think will work for everyone involved." I remained standing, declining the implicit invitation to sit on the sofa where they could literally look down at me. "Before you present proposals, I need to clarify something about yesterday. You stated that you were withdrawing financial support for the wedding. Since Marcus and I never requested or expected financial support, that announcement had no practical impact. We will proceed with our plans exactly as designed, with or without your approval or attendance." My mother's face tightened slightly. "Amanda, do not be deliberately obtuse. You know perfectly well that family weddings require family involvement. The social implications alone. The social implications concern you, not us," I interrupted, keeping my voice level. "Marcus and I are creating an event that reflects our values, and includes people who have supported our relationship. We are not staging a performance for your social circle. If you choose to attend, you will be welcomed as guests. If you choose not to attend, we will miss your presence, but the wedding will proceed regardless. Richard leaned forward, his expression hardening into something more openly hostile. You really think you can just dismiss us like that? Cut your family out of a major life event because we had reasonable concerns about your planning? Your concerns were not reasonable, I said flatly. They were attempts to exert control over decisions that are not yours to make. You have every right to choose not to attend or support our wedding. You have no right to expect us to modify our plans to accommodate your preferences when you are contributing nothing and have no authority over the event. We have authority as your family, my mother said, her voice rising slightly. As people who have supported you your entire life and deserve some consideration in return. This was the opening I needed, the transition from wedding conflict to deeper issues. I pulled out my phone, opened the photo gallery to the scanned deed documents I had prepared, and held it toward my mother. Let us talk about support and authority. Do you remember this document? She leaned forward, squinting at the screen, and I watched recognition dawn across her face in stages. First confusion, then vague recollection, then something approaching alarm as she understood what she was looking at. That is the trust document for the house, she said slowly. From when your father bought this property. Correct, I confirmed. The deed that establishes me as the legal owner of 247 Birchwood Lane, with you holding lifetime residency rights. The trust that my father created to protect both of us, to ensure you would always have a home while also ensuring that no one could manipulate or exploit that security for their own purposes. Richard stood abruptly, crossing the room to look at my phone screen. His face cycled through several expressions before settling on barely controlled anger. That arrangement is outdated. Your mother and I are married now. The house should be jointly owned. This technicality is not a technicality, I said, pulling my phone back. It is the legal reality that governs this property. Every property tax payment, every insurance premium, every major maintenance expense for the past 12 years has been paid through the trust account my father established with me as the administrator. You live here rent-free because I have continued to honor my father's wishes and maintain those payments. But the authority over this property, the legal ownership, the ultimate decision-making power belongs to me. The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither my mother nor Richard had apparently considered. My mother sank back into the sofa, her carefully constructed composure beginning to fracture. Richard remained standing, his body language aggressive even as his legal position crumbled under information he should have known but had apparently convinced himself did not matter. Why are you bringing this up now? My mother asked quietly. What does the house have to do with your wedding? Everything, I said, finally sitting because I wanted to be at eye level for what came next. The house is where this pattern started. Richard moved in without consulting me, began making changes without my approval, and has spent the past 5 years treating property he does not own as though it belongs to him. You have allowed and enabled that behavior, presumably because Richard convinced you that my legal ownership was meaningless or because it was easier to pretend the situation was different than it actually is. I did not think it mattered, my mother said, her voice defensive. You were in Boston building your life. The house is my home. It seemed like unnecessary complication to involve you in every decision about how Richard and I chose to live here. Choosing paint colors or furniture arrangements does not require my involvement. I agreed. But refinancing attempts do. Equity line applications do. Proposals to transfer the deed do. Richard has contacted my father's attorney repeatedly trying to access this property's value, trying to leverage what he thinks is my mother's ownership into financial instruments he can control. Lawrence Weinstein has documented every attempt, every pressure tactic, every end run around the legal structure my father created specifically to prevent exactly this kind of exploitation. Richard's face had gone from red to pale, the color draining as he realized how much I knew about activities he thought were private. Those were legitimate financial planning discussions, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Married couples typically hold property jointly. I was simply trying to normalize an unusual arrangement. You were trying to access equity that does not belong to you, I corrected. You were attempting to borrow against a property you have no legal interest in. using my mother's residency rights as leverage to pressure a title transfer that would give you control over nearly $800,000 in value that my father specifically protected from exactly this scenario. My mother was shaking her head slowly, as though physical motion could deny what she was hearing. Amanda, you are making this sound calculated and predatory. Richard was trying to help secure our financial future, to make sure we had resources available if we needed them. If that were true, he would have discussed it with me as the legal owner, I said. He would have explained his reasoning and requested my cooperation rather than attempting to circumvent my authority entirely. The fact that he went behind my back repeatedly, despite being told by an attorney that what he wanted was not legally possible, reveals that his interest is not in your security but in accessing value he believes should be his by virtue of marrying you. Richard moved back to his chair, sitting heavily, his earlier aggressive posture collapsing into something more defensive. You think you understand everything because you have some documents and a suspicious mind. Your father set up that trust because he was paranoid and controlling, not because there was any real danger. He did not trust your mother to make her own decisions about her own life. The insult to my father was deliberate, designed to provoke an emotional response that would undermine my credibility. I recognized the tactic and refused to take the bait. My father trusted my mother completely. What he did not trust was the possibility that someone might take advantage of her vulnerability during grief, might present themselves as helpful while actually being exploitative, might prioritize their own interests over her well-being. His planning was not about control. It was about protection. And given what I have learned about your behavior over the past 5 years, his concerns were completely justified. What exactly are you accusing Richard of? My mother asked, her voice tight with defensive anger on her husband's behalf. I pulled out a folder I had prepared before leaving Boston, containing printed summaries of the quarterly reports Lawrence had been providing. I am not accusing. I am documenting. Here are the 12 times Richard contacted the trust attorney about refinancing. Here are the property tax payments that you never see because they are handled directly through the trust. Here are the insurance premiums. Here are the major maintenance expenses, including the roof replacement 3 years ago that cost $42,000 and that Richard claimed he paid for, but that was actually covered by the trust fund. And here is the equity line application he submitted to 3 different banks 18 months ago, forging your signature to claim joint ownership authority he does not possess. I spread the documents on the coffee table between us, watching my mother's face as she picked up first one page and then another, reading details about her own living situation that she had apparently been completely unaware of. Richard sat frozen, his jaw clenched, saying nothing because there was nothing he could say that would reframe this information in his favor. You forged my signature? My mother said finally, looking at Richard with an expression I could not fully read. I thought you would agree if you understood the financial advantages, Richard said, his voice lower now, less certain. I was trying to help. We could have access funds for improvements, for investments, for building a stronger financial foundation together. You were trying to help yourself, I said quietly. You saw equity you wanted to access and you decided that my mother's marriage to you entitled you to property my father specifically protected from this exact scenario. When legal methods did not work, you attempted illegal ones. Forging signatures on financial documents is fraud, Richard. The only reason you are not facing criminal charges is that the banks caught the discrepancy and rejected the applications before any actual transfer occurred. My mother set the documents down with hands that shook slightly. Amanda, why are you telling me this now? Why not months ago when you apparently knew about these attempts? Because you would not have believed me, I said honestly. Because you had chosen Richard, had built your life around him, and any information that challenged that choice would have been rejected as my misunderstanding or my resentment about your remarriage. I hoped that the legal protections would be sufficient, that the trust structure would prevent actual harm even if it could not prevent attempted harm. But yesterday at the florist, you made clear that you have chosen full alignment with Richard regardless of truth, fairness, or respect for my autonomy. That choice has consequences. What consequences? Richard asked, his voice hard again despite his weakened position. You think you can threaten us? You are still just a child playing with documents you do not understand. I understand them perfectly well, I said, meeting his gaze directly. And the consequences are not threats. They are simply realities you have been ignoring. This house is mine. You live here because I allow it, because I honor my father's wishes regarding my mother's lifetime residency rights. But those rights belong to my mother, not to you. Your presence here is dependent entirely on your marriage to her, and on my continued willingness to tolerate your occupation of property you have no legal interest in. The implication hung in the air, obvious and unavoidable. Richard's face went through several expressions before settling on something calculating. You would not dare evict your own mother. I would not and will not evict my mother, I agreed. Her residency rights are protected and I will honor them completely. But your residency is not protected. You have no legal standing here. If I chose to revoke your permission to occupy this property, you would be legally required to leave while my mother retained her full rights to remain. The house would still be her home. It simply would not be yours. My mother's sharp intake of breath indicated she had understood something she had not previously considered. You cannot separate us like that. We are married. If Richard goes, I go. That would be your choice to make, I said gently. But it would not be a forced choice. You would always have a home here regardless of what happens with your marriage. That was my father's entire purpose in creating this structure. He wanted you to have security that did not depend on any relationship, that could not be taken away by circumstance or manipulation, that would endure regardless of what else changed in your life. Richard stood again, his control finally breaking. This is extortion. You are trying to break up our marriage by threatening our home. I am doing nothing of the kind, I said calmly. I am simply clarifying legal realities that you have been ignoring or pretending did not exist. Your marriage to my mother does not give you ownership of or authority over property that belongs to me. Your attempts to access that property's value without my knowledge or consent constitute fraud. And your current behavior, attempting to control my wedding decisions by threatening withdrawal of support you were never providing, reveals exactly the kind of manipulative character my father was protecting against. I stood, gathering my documents back into the folder. Here is what is going to happen. Marcus and I will proceed with our wedding exactly as planned. You are invited to attend as guests if you wish. Your approval or disapproval, your support or opposition, has no bearing on our decisions because you have no authority over them. Regarding this house, I will continue to maintain the trust, pay all expenses, and ensure my mother's lifetime residency rights are protected. But Richard, you need to understand clearly that your position here is entirely contingent on my tolerance and my mother's marriage. Any further attempts to access the property's equity, transfer ownership, or undermine the legal structure will result in immediate legal action, including possible criminal fraud charges for the forged documents. And if you continue to treat me with disrespect, to attempt control over my life decisions, or to manipulate my mother into choosing between our relationship and her marriage, I will seriously consider exercising my legal right to revoke your occupancy permission while maintaining her residency rights intact. The threat was clear, specific, and entirely legal. Richard's face showed that he finally understood he had miscalculated, had underestimated both my knowledge and my willingness to exercise authority I had held passively for over a decade. My mother looked between us, her expression torn, and I felt a wave of sadness for the choice she was being forced to see clearly for the first time. This is not about punishment, I said more softly. This is about boundaries and respect. I want a relationship with you, Mom, but not at the cost of accepting manipulation, control, and disrespect from Richard or from you when you enable his behavior. The choice is yours about how this proceeds. But you need to understand that the power dynamic you have been assuming does not actually exist. I am not a child requiring your approval. I am the legal owner of this property, the executor of my father's protective intentions, and an adult whose decisions deserve respect regardless of whether you agree with them. I moved toward the door, my folder tucked under my arm, my phone in my hand to call Marcus as promised. My mother followed me, her voice plaintive. Amanda, wait. Please. We can work this out. I did not know about Richard's applications. I did not understand how the trust actually functioned. Give us a chance to make this right. I paused at the door, looking at her with a mixture of love and loss. Making it right requires acknowledging what was wrong. It requires Richard accepting that he has no authority over property that is not his and never will be. It requires you deciding whether you want a relationship with your daughter that is based on mutual respect, or whether you are fully committed to prioritizing Richard's ego over everything else. Those are choices you need to make. I have already made mine. I left before she could respond, walking to my car with measured steps while my heart hammered against my ribs. The confrontation had been necessary, but it was not satisfying. Had clarified positions but had not resolved underlying conflicts. As I drove away from Birchwood Lane, I looked in the rearview mirror to see my mother standing on the porch, her hand raised halfway in a gesture that could have been a wave or a plea. Richard was not visible, presumably inside absorbing the demolition of assumptions he had built 5 years of behavior upon. The drive back to Boston felt longer than it had taken to arrive, every mile heavy with the weight of broken illusions and necessary truth-telling. I called Marcus as promised, gave him the short version of what had transpired, and heard the mixture of pride and concern in his voice as he asked if I was all right. I told him honestly that I did not know yet, that sometimes doing the right thing felt more like grief than triumph, that clarity about reality did not automatically make that reality easier to accept. By the time I reached our apartment, exhaustion had settled into my bones in a way that transcended mere physical tiredness. Marcus met me at the door, took my coat and folder, and drew me into an embrace that required nothing from me except presence. We stood that way for a long moment, his heartbeat steady against my ear, his arms a boundary between the complications I had left behind and the safety of the life we were building together. "What happens now?" he asked eventually. "Now they decide," I said quietly. "They have all the information they need to make informed choices. Whether Richard continues attempting to access property that is not his. Whether my mother continues enabling behavior that undermines her own daughter. Whether they can accept that I am an adult with authority they must respect, or whether they will escalate this conflict further. Those choices belong to them. And if they escalate?" I thought about the documents in my folder, about Lawrence Weinstein's contact information in my phone, about the legal authority I had been reluctant to exercise but was now fully prepared to use if necessary. Then they will discover that I meant every word I said today, and that the protection my father built was not symbolic but substantive, with teeth that can bite when required. Marcus nodded slowly, processing implications and possibilities. "The wedding stays exactly as planned." "The wedding stays exactly as planned," I confirmed. "That part is not negotiable, not subject to their approval, and not affected by whatever they decide to do next. We are getting married in October in the venue we chose, with the flowers we selected, surrounded by people who actually support us. Nothing they say or do can change that unless we allow it to, and we are not going to allow it." We spent the evening in quiet domesticity, cooking dinner together, reviewing vendor confirmations for the wedding, deliberately creating normalcy in the aftermath of confrontation. But beneath the ordinary routines, I was aware that something fundamental had shifted. I had stated my boundaries clearly, had exercised authority I had previously held passively, had forced my mother and Richard to confront realities they had been avoiding for years. There would be consequences for that honesty, reactions to that clarity, next moves in a conflict that was far from finished. But I was no longer operating from a position of uncertainty or accommodation. I knew exactly where I stood, what I was willing to accept, and what actions I would take if pushed further. My father had built protection into the foundation of that house on Birchwood Lane. Now I understood that the real foundation was not the property itself but the values and clarity that informed how that property was held and defended. And that foundation, unlike the relationship with my mother, remained solid, uncompromised, and strong enough to withstand whatever came next. The silence from Lexington lasted exactly 72 hours. During that time I moved through my normal routines with a heightened awareness of transition, recognizing that I was existing in the space between confrontation and consequence, waiting to see how my mother and Richard would respond to information that fundamentally altered their understanding of their own position. Marcus observed this watchfulness without commenting on it directly, simply maintaining his steady presence and ensuring that I ate meals and slept reasonably even when my mind insisted on cycling through scenarios and possibilities. On the third evening after my visit to Birchwood Lane, while Marcus and I were reviewing the final guest list for our wedding, My phone rang with a call from a number I did not immediately recognize. The area code was local to Connecticut, but the specific exchange was unfamiliar. I answered cautiously, half expecting a telemarketer or wrong number, and was surprised to hear a woman's voice that carried notes of both warmth and hesitation. Amanda Morgan? This is Catherine Walsh. I do not know if you remember me, but I was your mother's colleague at Lexington Academy years ago. I taught in the science department while your mother was in English. We worked together on several curriculum committees before I retired 5 years ago. The name triggered recognition immediately. Catherine Walsh had been a frequent presence at our house during my childhood and teenage years, often staying for dinner after working with my mother on school projects. She was perhaps 15 years older than my mother, a mentor figure who had helped guide her through the early years of teaching. I remembered her as sharp, principled, and kind, someone who spoke her mind but always with consideration for how her words would land. Of course I remember you, Mrs. Walsh, I said, curiosity mixing with confusion about why she would be calling me after years of no contact. How are you? I am well enough, though troubled by something I need to discuss with you if you have a few minutes, she said, her voice taking on a quality that suggested this was not a casual reconnection call. I had coffee with your mother yesterday. She asked to meet, which surprised me because we have not been particularly close since her marriage to Richard. What she told me during that conversation concerned me enough that I felt I needed to reach out to you directly, even though doing so might be overstepping boundaries. My attention sharpened immediately. What did she tell you? Catherine paused, seemingly choosing her words carefully. She presented a version of recent events that portrayed you as making unreasonable demands about her home, threatening to evict her because you disapproved of Richard, and attempting to control her life through legal technicalities related to property your father left behind. She was seeking my support or perhaps validation for the position that you were being cruel and manipulative. She wanted me to agree that adult children should not hold legal authority over their parents' homes, and that your father's estate planning was inappropriate and controlling. I felt my jaw tighten but forced myself to listen without interrupting. Catherine continued, her tone shifting to something more direct. I did not give her the support she was seeking because the story she told did not align with what I know about you, your father, or the circumstances around his death and estate planning. Your father discussed that property arrangement with me when he was setting it up, actually. He wanted perspective from someone outside the immediate family about whether his approach was sound. I told him then that I thought it was wise planning that protected both you and your mother while preventing potential exploitation during a vulnerable period. This information landed with unexpected weight. My father had consulted with Catherine about the trust structure, had sought outside perspective to ensure his approach was reasonable rather than controlling. This suggested both that he had doubts he wanted to test, and that he trusted Catherine's judgment enough to expose his thinking to scrutiny. It also meant that Catherine had context my mother either did not remember or was choosing to ignore in her current reframing of history. I did not know my father had discussed it with you, I said quietly. He told me he had consulted with his attorney and with my mother, but he did not mention seeking other perspectives. He was thorough in his planning, Catherine said, warmth entering her voice when speaking about my father. He respected your mother deeply, but he also understood human vulnerability and the reality that grief can make people susceptible to manipulation. He wanted to ensure that his planning was protective rather than controlling, that it served your mother's actual interests rather than simply imposing his preferences. After our conversation, I told him I thought the structure was sound and that I hoped it would never need to be actively used, but that having it in place was responsible stewardship. It is being actively used now, I said, deciding that Catherine's reach-out deserved honesty in return. Richard has been attempting to access the property's equity through various means, including forging my mother's signature on loan applications. When I confronted them about this and about their attempts to control my wedding planning, my mother chose to reframe the entire situation as me being unreasonably controlling rather than acknowledging Richard's behavior or her enabling of it. Catherine made a soft sound that might have been disappointment or recognition. That aligns with what I suspected. Your mother's description of events had internal contradictions that suggested she was repeating Richard's interpretation rather than presenting her own understanding. She seemed genuinely confused about the property arrangement despite having been present when it was established. I got the impression that Richard has been presenting a version of reality to her that is substantially different from actual facts. This observation opened something in my chest, a small space for understanding my mother's position that was separate from judging her choices. If Richard had been systematically misrepresenting the property situation, if he had been telling my mother that the trust was a meaningless technicality or that my ownership was somehow illegitimate or temporary, then her confusion and defensiveness might be based on genuinely not understanding the reality of her own living situation rather than deliberately choosing manipulation over honesty. "Mrs. Walsh, why are you telling me this?" I asked, needing to understand her motivation for inserting herself into a family conflict that could easily become uncomfortable for her. "Because I think you need allies right now who understand the full context," she said simply. "And because I think your mother needs someone who will tell her truth instead of supporting whatever narrative feels most comfortable in the moment." I told her during our coffee that I could not support her position without understanding more, and that I thought she should speak with the estate attorney who handled your father's planning to refresh her memory about what was actually established and why. She did not respond well to that suggestion, which told me that she is not currently in a place where she can hear information that contradicts what Richard has been telling her. "Did she ask you to contact me?" I asked, trying to understand the dynamics at play. "No," Catherine said firmly. "She would be angry if she knew I was calling you. But I am not calling you for her benefit. I am calling because I knew your father, I respect what he built and tried to protect, and I believe you are in a position where having someone who can speak to his intentions and planning process might be valuable. If you face legal challenges or family pressure to modify the trust arrangement, having a witness who can testify to your father's thinking and the care he took in establishing this structure might matter." The offer was both generous and strategically significant. Catherine was essentially volunteering to serve as a witness to my father's intentions, to provide testimony that could counteract any narrative Richard might construct about the trust being inappropriate or my ownership being an accident of paperwork rather than deliberate planning. She was also offering herself as a potential intermediary with my mother, someone who had historical credibility and no stake in the current conflict beyond wanting truth to prevail over manipulation. "I appreciate this more than I can adequately express," I said, feeling emotion tighten my throat. "The timing is significant because Marcus and I are getting married in 6 weeks, and my mother has been attempting to use wedding-related conflicts as leverage to force changes in how I manage the property. Having someone who understands the historical context and my father's intentions provides grounding that I did not realize I needed." Catherine's voice softened with something that sounded like relief. "I am glad I called then. I debated for 2 days whether this was appropriate or overstepping, but ultimately I decided that remaining silent when I have relevant information would be a failure of responsibility to your father's memory and to you. If you need me to provide documentation of your father's consultation with me, or if you need someone to speak with your mother about the realities of the situation, or if you simply need someone who remembers your father and can remind you that his planning was loving rather than controlling, please do not hesitate to reach out." We exchanged current contact information and Catherine promised to write down her recollections of the conversations with my father, while they were still clear in her mind, creating a contemporaneous record that might prove valuable if legal challenges emerged. Before ending the call, she asked about the wedding, listened to my brief description of our plans, and offered congratulations that sounded genuine and supportive in a way that created an unexpected lump in my throat. After we hung up, I sat for a long moment holding the phone, processing this unexpected expansion of my support network. Marcus had been working at his laptop during the call, but had clearly been listening based on the knowing look he gave me when I set the phone down. "Unexpected ally?" he asked. "Very unexpected," I confirmed, filling him in on the full conversation. "She essentially just volunteered to serve as a witness to my father's intentions, and to potentially intervene with my mother if that becomes necessary. She also confirmed that Richard has been systematically misrepresenting the property situation to my mother, which explains some of my mother's confusion and defensiveness." "Does that change how you feel about your mother's role in this?" Marcus asked carefully. I considered the question seriously, recognizing that it mattered both strategically and emotionally. It creates more room for understanding her position, while not excusing her choices. Even if Richard has been lying to her about the property arrangements, She is still choosing to align with him against me without verifying his claims or asking questions that would reveal the truth. She is still prioritizing his comfort over our relationship. But it does suggest that there might be a path to rebuilding relationship if she is ever willing to separate Richard's narratives from actual reality. The conversation with Catherine also prompted me to think more systematically about who else might have relevant information, perspective, or willingness to provide support during what was clearly becoming a more complex conflict than a simple disagreement about wedding planning. I spent the following morning creating a list of people who had known my father, who had been present during the estate planning period, or who might have observations about Richard's behavior that would be valuable if situations escalated. The first person I contacted was Lawrence Weinstein, my father's estate attorney. I had maintained professional but distant contact with him over the years, receiving quarterly reports and occasionally asking questions about trust administration, but I had not had a substantive conversation with him since shortly after my father's death. When I called his office and explained that I needed a more comprehensive consultation about the trust and potential challenges to it, his assistant scheduled an appointment for the following week and mentioned that Lawrence had been expecting this call for some time. That phrase, expecting this call, suggested that Lawrence had been monitoring the situation more closely than I realized and had perhaps been waiting for me to recognize that passive administration was no longer sufficient. When I arrived at his office the following Tuesday, taking a personal day from my work to make the trip to Connecticut, Lawrence greeted me with the mixture of professional formality and personal warmth that had characterized our previous interactions. Lawrence Weinstein was in his late 60s, a man who had built his practice on estate planning and trust administration for families who valued careful stewardship over aggressive wealth accumulation. His office reflected this philosophy, furnished with quality pieces that had clearly been selected for durability and function rather than fashion, lined with legal texts that showed evidence of actual use, rather than decorative presence. He gestured me to a chair across from his desk and pulled out a file that was substantially thicker than I expected. I have been documenting Richard Coleman's attempts to access or modify the property arrangement since he first contacted me 4 years ago, Lawrence said without preamble, opening the file to reveal meticulously organized correspondence, notes from phone calls, and copies of documents Richard had submitted to various institutions. Your father anticipated this possibility when he structured the trust. He did not know specifically who might attempt exploitation, but he understood human nature well enough to recognize that your mother's vulnerability during grief might attract someone who saw opportunity rather than partnership. The thickness of the file was both validating and disturbing. Validating because it confirmed that my concerns about Richard's behavior were not paranoid or exaggerated, but rather documented and witnessed. Disturbing because it revealed a level of persistence and calculation that exceeded what I had understood about Richard's attempts to undermine the legal structure protecting my mother. What exactly has he attempted? I asked, needing to understand the full scope. Lawrence pulled out a summary document he had clearly prepared in anticipation of this meeting. Chronologically, his first contact was 6 months after marrying your mother. He called to inquire about transferring the property into joint ownership, presenting it as a routine administrative correction. When I explained that such a transfer was neither routine nor possible without your explicit consent as the legal owner, he became argumentative and suggested that I was misinterpreting the trust documents. I provided him with copies of the relevant provisions and thought that would resolve the matter. But it did not, I said, already knowing where this was heading. It did not, Lawrence confirmed. 3 months later, he contacted a different attorney in our firm, apparently hoping that someone else would provide a different answer. That attorney referred him back to me after reviewing the file. Then he began approaching banks about home equity lines of credit, providing documentation that misrepresented the ownership structure. Several banks contacted me to verify information before proceeding, which allowed me to catch and stop those applications. Others apparently did not verify, which resulted in the forged signature situation we discussed previously. He pulled out another section of the file, this one containing correspondence with various financial institutions. In total, over the past 4 years, Richard has made 17 separate attempts to access the property's equity through loans, refinancing, or title transfer. Each attempt has been documented and declined. Each attempt has revealed increasing sophistication in his understanding of what obstacles exist, and how he might try to circumvent them. The forged signature represents an escalation from manipulation to outright fraud, which is why I wanted to meet with you now to discuss what protections we should implement going forward. The systematic nature of Richard's attempts was more disturbing than isolated incidents would have been. This was not opportunistic behavior or misunderstanding about complex legal structures. This was calculated, persistent effort to access value that did not belong to him, refined over years as each attempt failed and taught him what obstacles needed to be overcome. It revealed a level of entitlement and disregard for legal boundaries that went beyond garden variety greed into something more concerning. What protections are you recommending? I asked, recognizing that Lawrence would not have raised this without having specific suggestions. First, I recommend we file formal notice with all major financial institutions in Connecticut that any loan application or credit inquiry involving the Birchwood Lane property requires direct verification with me as the trust attorney and with you as the legal owner, Lawrence said, pulling out draft forms already prepared. This creates a tripwire that makes any future attempts more difficult and ensures we know about them immediately rather than discovering them after the fact. Second, I recommend we conduct a comprehensive title search to ensure no liens or encumbrances have been placed against the property without proper authorization. Richard's sophistication has been increasing, and I want to verify that nothing has been successfully filed that we are not aware of. Third, I recommend we consider whether your mother's residency rights should be formally documented in a way that makes Richard's separate status explicit. Currently, the trust provisions protect your mother, but do not specifically address spouses or other household members. Creating clarity about Richard's lack of legal interest might prevent future confusion or misrepresentation. All three recommendations made strategic sense, creating layers of protection and documentation that would make Richard's continued attempts both more difficult and more likely to trigger legal consequences. I approved all three measures and signed the necessary authorizations for Lawrence to proceed. As we worked through the paperwork, I mentioned Catherine Walsh's call and her offer to document my father's consultation with her about the trust structure. Lawrence's expression brightened with recognition and approval. Catherine would be an excellent witness if we ever need to demonstrate your father's intentions and the care he took in planning. Her perspective as someone outside the family who nonetheless had deep knowledge of the circumstances would carry significant weight. I recommend you ask her to prepare a written statement describing her conversations with your father, dated and signed, that we can include in the file as contemporaneous documentation of his thinking. Contemporaneous might be stretching it since those conversations happened over a decade ago, I pointed out. Her recollections documented now are more contemporaneous than testimony provided years from now if this situation goes to court, Lawrence said pragmatically. Any documentation we can create now strengthens our position and creates a record that cannot be challenged as convenient reconstruction after the fact. If Catherine is willing to write down what she remembers about your father's reasoning and concerns, that becomes part of the evidentiary record supporting the trust structure. We spent another hour discussing various scenarios that might emerge, from Richard attempting to pressure my mother into challenging the trust, to him filing frivolous legal claims designed to create expense and uncertainty, to the possibility that the wedding conflict might be used as evidence that I was exercising ownership in ways that were punitive toward my mother rather than protective. Lawrence's experience with family conflicts over estates and trusts provided valuable perspective on tactics and responses, on what would strengthen my position, and what might create unnecessary vulnerability. As our meeting concluded, Lawrence leaned back in his chair and offered an observation that went beyond legal strategy into personal counsel. Your father was a remarkable man who understood that protection often requires anticipating problems that have not yet manifested. He planned carefully because he loved deeply. The structure he created is not about control but about ensuring that the people he cared about would have security regardless of what circumstances emerged. You are honoring his intentions by maintaining those protections even when doing so creates conflict. That is stewardship, Amanda. That is exactly what he hoped you would be capable of when the time came. The validation from someone who had known my father professionally and understood his values created an unexpected wave of emotion that I had to blink back before responding. I keep second-guessing whether I am doing this right, whether I am being too rigid or too suspicious, whether I should be finding more room for compromise. Compromise is appropriate when both parties are operating in good faith. Lawrence said gently. Richard's documented pattern of behavior over 4 years demonstrates that he is not operating in good faith. He is systematically attempting to circumvent legal protections through increasingly problematic means. Maintaining boundaries against that behavior is not rigidity. It is responsibility. Your father trusted you to exercise good judgment about when protection required active defense. Everything I see suggests you are exercising exactly the judgment he hoped for. I left Lawrence's office with the thick file copied for my own records, with action items documented and responsibilities clarified, and with the beginning of a network of professional and personal support that transformed the conflict from something I was managing alone into something that had appropriate structure and resources behind it. The drive back to Boston felt different than previous trips, less weighted with isolation and more grounded in the reality that I was not inventing concerns or overreacting to normal family tension, but rather responding appropriately to documented patterns of exploitation. The following evening, I called Catherine Walsh and asked if she would be willing to write down her recollections of my father's consultation with her about the trust structure. She agreed immediately, asking thoughtful questions about what level of detail would be most useful and what format would serve the purpose best. We discussed her memories of specific conversations, the concerns my father had expressed, and the reasoning he had shared about wanting to protect both my mother and myself while preventing potential exploitation by anyone who might see my mother's grief as opportunity. He was very clear that this was not about doubting your mother's judgment in normal circumstances, Catherine recalled, her voice thoughtful as she worked through memories from over a decade earlier. He said specifically that Evelyn was one of the smartest, most capable people he knew, but that grief creates vulnerability even in strong people, and that someone who appeared helpful and supportive during that vulnerability might actually be positioning themselves for exploitation. He wanted to create structure that would protect her without requiring constant vigilance from you, structure that would make exploitation difficult even if someone attempted it. That describes exactly what has happened, I said quietly. Richard presented himself as helpful and supportive, married my mother during her grief, and has spent the past 5 years attempting to access equity. He has no legitimate claim to while treating my ownership as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a legal reality to be respected. Your father would be proud of how you are handling this, Catherine said firmly. He was not protecting against a specific person but against a specific pattern of behavior. The fact that the pattern manifested exactly as he anticipated, and that the protections he built are functioning as intended, validates his planning completely. You are doing exactly what he trusted you to do. These conversations with Lawrence and Catherine created something I had not fully recognized I needed. Validation from people who had known my father, understood his values and intentions, and could confirm that my interpretation of my responsibilities was consistent with what he had hoped for. Their support was not based on taking sides in a family conflict, but rather on understanding the legal and ethical framework my father had established and affirming that I was honoring that framework appropriately. Over the following days, I also reached out to several of my father's former colleagues from his architecture practice, people who had worked with him on projects and who might have observations about his character, values, and approach to problem-solving that would be relevant if Richard attempted to portray the trust structure as controlling or inappropriate. These conversations were briefer than those with Catherine and Lawrence, but they created a network of people who remembered my father positively, who could speak to his thoughtfulness and integrity, and who were willing to provide perspective if needed. Marcus observed this network building with approval, recognizing that I was shifting from reactive management to proactive strategy, from handling problems as they emerged to creating infrastructure that would support whatever came next. One evening as we reviewed wedding RSVPs together, he set down the spreadsheet we were updating and looked at me with the direct assessment that meant he was about to say something important. You have stopped apologizing for taking up space, he observed. When you talk about the house, about your ownership, about your responsibilities, you are not hedging anymore or softening language to make it more palatable. You are stating facts and standing in your authority without qualification. I considered this observation, recognizing its accuracy. Somewhere in the process of documenting Richard's behavior, consulting with Lawrence and connecting with people who affirmed my father's intentions, I had shifted from feeling defensive about my position to simply occupying it. The ownership was not something I needed to justify or explain away. It was simply reality, established deliberately by my father, maintained responsibly by me, and defended appropriately when challenged. I think I needed to understand that this is not about me being controlling or unreasonable, I said slowly, working through the realization as I spoke. This is about a structure my father built that is functioning exactly as he intended. Richard's attempts to undermine it and my mother's discomfort with it do not make the structure wrong. They make Richard's behavior inappropriate, and my mother's understanding incomplete. Shifting that framework from internal doubt to external clarity changes everything. It does, Marcus agreed. And it means that whatever happens next with your mother and Richard, you are not operating from uncertainty or guilt, but from grounded understanding of what you are protecting and why it matters. That is a much stronger position to negotiate from or defend from depending on what they choose to do. As if in response to this conversation, my phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. The message was longer than her usual brief communications, and its tone suggested it had been drafted and revised rather than sent impulsively. She wrote that she had been thinking about our last conversation, that she recognized there were things about the property situation she did not fully understand, and that she wanted to meet with me and Lawrence together to review the trust documents and clarify what the actual arrangements were, and why my father had structured them as he did. The request was both surprising and strategic. Surprising because it suggested my mother was recognizing gaps in her understanding that Richard had apparently not addressed honestly. Strategic because it positioned her as seeking information rather than demanding changes, as recognizing she needed education rather than insisting she already understood the situation. The request also implicitly acknowledged Lawrence's authority as the trust attorney and my authority as the person who needed to consent to such a meeting. I showed the message to Marcus, who read it carefully before offering his assessment. This could be genuine curiosity, or it could be Richard's strategy to gain more information about the trust structure under the guise of your mother seeking education. Either way, agreeing to the meeting with Lawrence present provides protection because anything discussed will be documented and witnessed by a professional who understands the implications. I agreed with his analysis and responded to my mother that I would coordinate with Lawrence about scheduling a comprehensive review meeting where all questions about the trust structure, my father's intentions, and the current management could be addressed thoroughly. I also made clear that this meeting would include only my mother, Lawrence, and myself, that Richard would not be included because the trust provisions concerned my mother's rights rather than his, and that the purpose was educational rather than negotiational. My mother's response came quickly. Richard should be there since he is my husband and this affects our household. He has questions too. I replied with careful precision. The trust addresses your residency rights specifically. Richard's presence in the household is consequent to your marriage, but he has no legal interest in the property that would require his inclusion in discussions about trust administration. If he has questions, he can direct them to his own attorney. This meeting is about clarifying the arrangements that protect you, not about negotiating changes that would benefit him. The bluntness was intentional, establishing clearly that I understood the dynamics at play, and was not going to allow Richard to use my mother's information seeking as a vehicle for his continued attempts to find weaknesses in the legal structure. My mother did not respond immediately, which suggested she was consulting with Richard about how to respond to boundaries she had not expected me to maintain. When her response came several hours later, it was notably shorter. Fine. Let me know when Lawrence can meet. I coordinated with Lawrence, who expressed approval of the meeting structure and volunteered to prepare a comprehensive presentation that would walk through every aspect of the trust, my father's documented intentions through the planning process, and the administration over the past 12 years. He suggested we conduct the meeting at his office rather than at Birchwood Lane, creating both literal and figurative neutral ground that would be documented and professional rather than personal and emotional. As I confirmed these arrangements, I recognized that the support network I had assembled over the past week was fundamentally changing the nature of the conflict. I was no longer a single person attempting to defend decisions against family pressure, while second-guessing whether my interpretation of responsibilities was accurate. I was now operating within a structure of professional counsel, documented evidence, corroborating witnesses, and clear legal authority that transformed the conversation from emotional manipulation to factual presentation. The wedding remained 6 weeks away, our plans progressing smoothly despite the family turmoil. Vendor confirmations arrived, our guest list stabilized at 63 people who had all enthusiastically accepted, and the venue coordinator sent updated layouts that showed exactly how our vision would manifest in physical space. The contrast between the clean forward motion of wedding planning and the complicated backward-looking conflict about property and family was stark but also clarifying. One represented the life Marcus and I were actively building together. The other represented obligations inherited from the past that required management but not primary focus. As I marked the date for the meeting with Lawrence and my mother on our shared calendar, Marcus looked over my shoulder and made an observation that captured something essential about this entire situation. You are protecting your mother whether she understands it or not, whether she wants it or not, and whether Richard likes it or not. That is what real stewardship looks like. It is not always comfortable and it is not always appreciated, but it is always necessary. He was right. And that clarity, supported by the network I had assembled and the documentation I had gathered, provided foundation that would hold regardless of what came next. My mother would learn the truth about her own living situation. Richard would face the reality that his exploitation attempts were documented and would have consequences. And I would continue honoring my father's intentions while building the future he had hoped I would create. The pieces were in position. The support was assembled. And whatever came next would be met not with uncertainty, but with grounded confidence in the rightness of the protection I was maintaining. The meeting with Lawrence Weinstein was scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, a time deliberately chosen to require my mother to take a half-day from her teaching position and to ensure the discussion would not be rushed by end-of-day pressures. I had taken the entire day off from my architectural firm in Boston, wanting to arrive early and review materials with Lawrence before my mother joined us. Marcus had offered to accompany me for moral support, but I declined, recognizing that this conversation needed to be between the principals without introducing additional dynamics that might distract from the core educational purpose. I arrived at Lawrence's office 90 minutes before the scheduled meeting, carrying my own file of documentation that had grown substantially over the past 2 weeks. Lawrence greeted me in his conference room, where he had already set up presentation materials that demonstrated the thoroughness I had come to expect from him. The table was arranged with 3 stations, each containing identical binders that he had prepared specifically for this meeting. The binders were substantial, easily 2 inches thick, with tab sections that promised comprehensive coverage of every aspect of the trust structure. Lawrence gestured me to sit beside him rather than across the table, positioning us as a united front of information providers rather than adversaries to my mother. This subtle spatial arrangement reflected the meeting's purpose, which was education rather than confrontation, clarification rather than negotiation. He opened one of the binders to show me the structure he had created, walking through each section with the systematic precision that characterized all his work. The first section contained the original trust documents, including the deed that established my ownership, and the provisions that protected my mother's lifetime residency rights. Lawrence had included not just the final executed versions but also earlier drafts with my father's handwritten notes in the margins, showing the evolution of his thinking and the specific concerns he was addressing through various provisions. These drafts revealed a level of care and thoughtfulness that went far beyond standard estate planning, showing my father wrestling with how to balance protection with autonomy, security with flexibility. One note in particular stood out, written in my father's distinctive careful printing beside a clause about modification procedures. Must ensure Evelyn's security cannot be compromised by future relationships or financial pressure, while also ensuring Amanda has authority to respond to circumstances I cannot anticipate. Balance is critical. Neither control nor neglect. Protection that enables rather than constrains. Seeing my father's actual words about his intentions created an unexpected surge of emotion that I had to breathe through before I could speak. Lawrence noticed and waited patiently, allowing me time to process before continuing his presentation. When I had regained composure, he moved to the second section of the binder, which documented the trust administration over the 12 years since my father's death. This section was remarkably detailed, containing quarterly reports that showed every payment made from the trust account, every maintenance issue addressed, every insurance claim filed, and every decision made about the property. The documentation revealed a pattern of consistent, responsible stewardship that had required no action from my mother beyond living in the house and enjoying its security. Property taxes had been paid promptly every year. Insurance premiums had been maintained at appropriate coverage levels. Major maintenance issues, including the roof replacement, furnace upgrade, and foundation waterproofing, had been addressed proactively before they created emergencies. Lawrence had also included financial projections showing the trust's current balance and expected longevity, based on historical expenses and conservative investment returns. The analysis demonstrated that the trust was sustainably funded to continue covering all property expenses for at minimum another 40 years, well beyond any reasonable life expectancy considerations. This projection directly contradicted any narrative Richard might have constructed about the trust being inadequate or requiring supplementation through home equity access. The third section addressed Richard specifically, documenting his 17 attempts to access the property's equity or modify the ownership structure. Lawrence had organized these chronologically, showing the escalation from initial inquiries to increasingly sophisticated attempts to circumvent legal protections. Each attempt was documented with copies of correspondence, notes from phone conversations, and the responses that had declined his requests. The forged signature documents were included in a subsection marked with red tabs, with notations about the specific statutes that such forgery violated and the potential criminal penalties. This section also included documentation of contacts from financial institutions seeking verification of ownership before processing loan applications, demonstrating that Richard's attempts had not been limited to direct contact with Lawrence, but had extended to trying multiple banks and lenders in hopes that one would process applications without proper verification. The pattern revealed someone who understood that his requests were improper, but was willing to attempt them repeatedly in hopes of finding a weak point in the protection structure. The fourth section contained witness statements and corroborating documentation about my father's intentions. Catherine Walsh's written recollections occupied several pages, describing in detail the conversation she had with my father about his estate planning concerns, his specific worries about my mother's vulnerability during grief, and his desire to create protection that would not require constant intervention but would be available if circumstances required it. Catherine's statement was notarized and dated, creating a formal record that could be used as evidence if legal challenges emerged. This section also included statements from two of my father's professional colleagues who had discussed the property planning with him, both confirming that he had expressed concerns about ensuring my mother's long-term security in ways that could not be compromised by future relationships or financial pressure. One colleague recalled my father specifically mentioning that widows often face pressure from new partners who saw property and assets as opportunities, rather than as legacies to be respected. The prescience of these concerns, given how accurately they described Richard's subsequent behavior, was striking. The fifth section outlined legal procedures and protections that had been implemented or could be implemented to strengthen the trust structure against future challenges. This included the institutional notifications Lawrence had filed to create verification requirements for any loan applications involving the property, the enhanced title monitoring to detect unauthorized liens or encumbrances, and the clarifications about Richard's lack of legal interest that made explicit what had previously been implicit in the trust provisions. Lawrence had also prepared draft documents that could be executed if circumstances warranted, including formal notices of trespass that could be filed against Richard if his behavior escalated to require his removal from the property, while maintaining my mother's residency rights intact. These drafts were clearly marked as contingency planning rather than immediate action, but their presence in the binder demonstrated that responses were prepared for various scenarios that might emerge. The final section addressed common questions and misconceptions about trust structures, providing clear explanations in accessible language about concepts like legal ownership versus beneficial use, lifetime estates, and the distinction between property rights and occupancy rights. This section appeared designed to help my mother understand the framework in which she existed without requiring her to have legal expertise, or to simply accept assertions without explanation. As Lawrence completed his walkthrough of the materials, I felt something shifting in my understanding of what this meeting represented. This was not simply about correcting my mother's misconceptions or defending against Richard's manipulation. This was about providing my mother with complete, accurate information about her own living situation, so that she could make informed choices about how to proceed. The education was protective in itself because knowledge eliminated the vulnerability that came from operating on incomplete or inaccurate information. We spent the next 45 minutes discussing how to present this information effectively. Lawrence recommended that we allow my mother to absorb the material at her own pace rather than presenting it as a rapid lecture, that we invite questions and provide clarification without becoming defensive, and that we focus on what the trust did to protect her interests rather than on what it prevented Richard from doing. The framing would emphasize security rather than limitation, protection rather than control, enabling rather than constraining. Lawrence also advised me to listen carefully to how my mother responded to various pieces of information, noting where she showed surprise or recognition or resistance, because her reactions would reveal what misconceptions Richard had established and where her understanding needed most correction. He suggested that I resist the urge to argue or convince, instead allowing the documented evidence to speak for itself and trusting that my mother was capable of drawing her own conclusions once she had accurate information. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.